They said he betrayed his country for an Apache woman. But no one in that dusty camp knew why he never reached for his gun that night. The rope hung loose in the morning wind, creaking against the wooden beam above Ethan Cole's head as if it had already decided his fate long before any man spoke it aloud, and the dust beneath his boots swirled in slow circles, kicked up by restless horses and the shifting weight of soldiers who refused to meet his eyes for too long, because it was easier to believe a man was guilty than to wonder if they were wrong. Ethan stood still, shoulders squared but not rigid, the way a man stands when he has already made peace with something no one else can see. His hands bound in front of him with coarse rope that scratched against his skin. Though he didn't flinch, not when the wind picked up, not when a voice from somewhere behind him muttered the word traitor under its breath. Not even when the commanding officer stepped forward, boots pressing firm into the dry earth, a folded piece of paper in hand that carried more weight than any rifle in that moment. Because paper could take a man's name and turn it into something unrecognizable. The officer cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the low murmur like a blade through cloth, and for a second, just a second, Ethan's gaze drifted past the line of soldiers, past the tents and the supply wagons, out toward the open stretch of land where the desert met the horizon in a blur of heat and light, and there, hidden in that distance, was a memory that no one here could see, no one here could understand, because to them it was simple. He had been sent to track, to report, to assist in closing in on a group they called hostile, and instead, he had returned alone, carrying nothing but silence and something small tucked inside his coat. The officer began to read, voice steady, words formal, each one placing another stone on a scale already tipped. Private Ethan Cole, you stand accused of aiding the escape of a known Apache figure of significance, withholding critical information from your commanding unit, and compromising military operations under direct order. The words drifted into the air and settled over the men like dust, and still Ethan said nothing, his jaw set, eyes calm, because explaining would require more than words. It would require them to see something they had spent their whole lives refusing to see. A horse somewhere off to the side let out a low breath, the leather saddle creaking as it shifted, and the sun climbed just enough to catch the edge of Ethan's face, drawing a thin line of light across his cheek, revealing the faintest trace of exhaustion, not from fear, but from remembering. The officer lowered the paper slightly, studying him, perhaps waiting for denial, for anger, for something that looked like the man they thought they knew, but Ethan only blinked once, slow, deliberate, as if measuring the space between this moment and another one entirely. A night where the air had been colder, sharper, and the silence had carried a different kind of weight. Inside his coat, pressed against his chest, the small object rested. A necklace, simple at a glance, a leather cord worn smooth with time, a turquoise stone at its center that caught light in a way that made it seem almost alive, and though no one here had seen it yet, it was the only truth he had chosen to keep, the only piece of that night he refused to surrender. The officer's voice rose again, asking if he had anything to say in his defense, the question hanging there, fragile, almost unnecessary, because the men had already decided, and Ethan knew it. He could feel it in the way their boots shifted, in the way their hands rested just a little too comfortably near their belts, not out of threat, but out of habit, the habit of standing on the side they believed was right. He inhaled once, slow, the dry air filling his lungs, carrying with it the faint scent of leather, dust, and something distant he couldn't name, and when he exhaled, his voice came low, steady, not loud enough to command attention, but strong enough that those closest leaned in without realizing it. I did what needed to be done, he said, and nothing more, because anything beyond that would have sounded like a story, and stories didn't survive in places like this, not when they challenged the lines drawn between enemy and ally. A ripple moved through the gathered men, subtle, uncertain, as if for a brief moment the ground beneath their certainty shifted, but just as quickly, it settled again, because doubt was a dangerous thing to carry in a place built on orders. The officer straightened, folding the paper back with precise movements, and somewhere in the distance, far beyond the reach of their camp, beyond the ridge where the land dipped into shadow, something stirred, unseen, unheard. By most, but not by Ethan, whose eyes flickered just slightly, not in fear, not in hope, but in recognition, as if the story they thought was ending here had already begun somewhere else entirely, in a place where war and love did not ask permission to exist in the same breath. The silence after his words did not break all at once. It stretched thin like wire pulled too tight, and somewhere in that tension a memory began to press forward, uninvited and impossible to ignore, because before the rope, before the accusation, there had been a night where the desert did not belong to soldiers or orders, only to the sound of wind moving across stone and the faint rhythm of a horse that no longer carried a rider. Ethan remembered the moment clearly, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a man listen to things he usually ignores, like the shift of gravel under his boots or the way the air changes just before something unseen reveals itself. And he had been alone then, sent ahead of his unit to scout a narrow pass that cut through the canyon like a scar, a place maps did not fully capture and men did not trust. Yet orders were orders, and Ethan had always followed them, right up until the moment he did not. The sun had already dropped behind the ridge, leaving the land painted in fading shades of gold and shadow, and it was there, near a cluster of low rock formations, that he first saw her, though at the time he did not know who she was, only that she stood with a stillness that did not belong to someone lost or afraid, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on him from a distance that made most men reach for a weapon without thinking. But Ethan did not because he trusted her, but because something about the way she stood suggested that she was not the one in danger. She wore no sign of surrender, no sign of fear, only the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided how this moment would end. And when he took a step forward, slow, measured, she did not move back, she did not speak, she simply watched, as if weighing him against something he could not see. "You are far from your men." Her voice came, steady, carrying, across the space between them without effort, and it struck him not for its meaning, but for its calm, as if she were stating a fact rather than asking a question. And Ethan paused, not out of hesitation, but because the truth in her words left little room for denial. "I could say the same," he replied, his tone even, though his eyes never left hers, and for a moment, something almost like amusement touched her expression, not a smile, not warmth, but recognition, as if he had answered correctly to a question he did not know he was being asked. The wind shifted then, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and sage, and in that small change Ethan noticed something else, a subtle tension in her stance, not directed at him, but beyond him, toward the path he had taken to get there, and before he could turn, before he could ask, she moved, not toward him but past him, her steps quick and precise, and in that motion there was no panic, only urgency, and instinct pulled at him, not the kind trained by drills and commands, but something older, something that told him this was not a moment to stand still. He turned, scanning the ridge behind him, and though he saw nothing at first, he felt it, the presence of others, unseen but close enough to matter, and when he looked back at her, she had stopped, just far enough away that distance could become a choice, and in her hand, something small caught the last light of the setting sun, a flicker of turquoise against leather, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as two people standing on opposite sides of something neither of them had built. And then she spoke again, softer this time, not a command, not a warning, but something in between. "If you go back now, you will not find what you are looking for." And Ethan understood then that whatever lay ahead, whatever orders had sent him here, had already changed the moment he saw her, because turning back would mean pretending this moment never happened, and moving forward would mean stepping into something he could not control. He did not answer her, not with words, but with action, taking one step closer, instead of away, and in that single movement, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, as if the line drawn between them had been crossed without either of them naming it, and the desert, wide and indifferent, held its breath as the first choice was made, long before anyone would call it betrayal. She watched that step the way a hunter watches the wind, not for what it is, but for what it carries, and for a moment the distance between them felt thinner, like something fragile that could break if either one spoke too quickly. Yet neither did, because words had a way of choosing sides before a man or a woman was ready to. Ethan stopped just short of closing the space completely, close enough now to see the details others would have missed, the faint dust along the hem of her dress, the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the way her hand rested near that small turquoise pendant as if it were not decoration but memory. And he realized then that she was not alone in this moment, even if no one else stood beside her, because everything she carried, her people, her land, her history, stood with her in silence. "You should not have come here," she said, not as a warning, but as a simple truth, and Ethan could have answered with duty, with orders, with all the things he had been taught to say, but instead he found himself asking something else entirely. And you should not have stayed. And the words surprised even him, because they did not sound like a soldier speaking. They sounded like a man trying to understand something he had not been trained to see. A flicker passed through her eyes then. Not anger, not approval, something quieter, something that recognized the shift, without trusting it, and she took a slow step to the side, not retreating, not advancing, but changing the line between them. "Your men are not far," she said, her gaze drifting past him again, and this time Ethan did not ignore it. He followed it, turning just enough to catch the faintest movement along the ridge, a shadow where there should have been none, a sign that the world he knew was already catching up to this moment. "They are not looking for me," he replied, though even as he said it, he knew it was no longer entirely true, because the path he had taken, the time he had spent, the silence he carried back, all of it had begun to draw questions he could not answer without unraveling something deeper. She studied him for a long second, the kind of look that measured more than words, that weighed intention against instinct, and then she spoke again, quieter now, as if the desert itself might be listening. "They are looking for something they do not understand." And there was no accusation in her voice, only certainty, the kind that comes from seeing the same mistake repeated across years and generations until it no longer feels like a mistake at all. The wind shifted again, cooler now, carrying the distant echo of something that might have been a horse or might have been nothing at all, and Ethan felt the pull of time in a way he had not before, the sense that whatever choice he made here would not wait for him to be ready. It would simply become part of him, whether he wanted it or not. "Then help me understand," he said, the words leaving him before he could measure them, and for the first time, something in her expression changed in a way that could not be mistaken. Not softened, not lowered, but opened just enough to reveal that she had not expected that answer. Because men like him did not ask for understanding, they demanded compliance, and yet here he stood, asking instead of taking. She looked at him then, truly looked, not at the uniform, not at the role he carried, but at the man standing inside it, and for a moment the world around them seemed to quiet, as if even the land was waiting to see what she would decide. Her fingers brushed lightly against the pendant at her throat, and when she spoke, her voice carried something new, something that felt less like distance and more like a test. "Understanding comes with a cost," she said, and Ethan held her gaze without looking away, because he had already begun to feel that cost, though he could not yet name it. "So does ignorance," he answered, and the words settled between them, not heavy, not light, but balanced in a way that made it impossible to ignore what they implied. Somewhere behind him, closer now, the sound of movement grew clearer, no longer a suggestion but a presence, and the moment tightened, the space between decision and consequence shrinking with every passing second, and she knew it as well as he did, her posture shifting slightly, ready not for him, but for what followed. "If you stay," she said, her voice steady, "you will not be able to go back the same," and there was no threat in it, only truth, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard, and Ethan felt something settle inside him then, not certainty, not peace, but a quiet acceptance that whatever came next would belong to him alone. He glanced once more toward the ridge, toward the path that had brought him here, toward the world that expected him to return unchanged, and then he looked back at her, at the woman who stood between that world and something else entirely, and without another word, he reached into his coat, not for a weapon, not for defense, but for the map folded there, the one that marked the canyon paths and the routes his men would take, and he held it for a second longer than necessary before extending it toward her, not as surrender, not as betrayal, but as a choice, quiet and deliberate, that could not be undone once made, and in that single motion, the line between soldier and something else blurred just enough that even he could no longer see where it began or ended. She did not take the map right away, and that hesitation carried more weight than refusal ever could, because it told Ethan that this was not a simple exchange, not a moment where one side gave and the other accepted. It was something else entirely, something that demanded she decide whether he was a man worth trusting or just another version of everything she had been taught to resist. Her eyes moved from the folded paper in his hand to his face again, searching, measuring, and for a brief second the world around them seemed to narrow to that single space between their breaths, the wind slowing as if even it wanted to hear her answer, and when she finally reached out, her fingers brushed the edge of the map but did not yet claim it. "You do not understand what you are offering," she said, her voice low, not unkind, but firm in a way that carried generations behind it, and Ethan felt that truth settle somewhere deep because he knew she was right. He did not understand everything, but he understood enough to know that walking away now would be easier, safer, and wrong in a way that would follow him long after the desert forgot his footprints. "Then show me," he answered, and there was no challenge in his tone, no demand, only a quiet willingness to step into something uncertain, and that, more than the map, was what made her pause. She took the paper then, slow, deliberate, as if the act itself marked a line neither of them could step back across, and as she unfolded it, the fading light caught the markings, the paths drawn in careful lines, the routes his men would take, the places they believed gave them control over a land they had never truly known, and for a moment she simply looked at it, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if she had always known these lines existed, even if she had never seen them drawn. "They think this is the way," she said quietly, her finger tracing one of the marked paths, and then she shook her head slightly, a movement so small it might have been missed by anyone else. "But the land does not follow their lines." And with that, she turned the map, adjusting it, not to match the direction he had been taught, but to align it with something only she could see, something that did not exist on paper but lived in memory, in story, in the quiet knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Ethan watched her do it, felt something shift again, not in the world around him, but in the way he saw it, because for the first time he realized that what he had been given as certainty was only one version of truth, one that did not account for everything it tried to control. "If they follow this path," she continued, her voice steady, "they will not find us." And the way she said us did not go unnoticed, not by Ethan, not by the part of him that had already begun to step away from the line he once stood on. And yet there was no comfort in it, no ease, only the quiet weight of what that word now included. The sound behind them grew clearer then, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, and both of them turned slightly, not in panic, but in acknowledgement of what was coming, because the moment they stood in was never meant to last, it was only meant to change them. She folded the map again, quicker this time, more certain, and handed it back to him, but not in the way he expected, not as something returned, but as something shared, her hand, lingering for just a second longer than necessary, long enough for him to understand that this was not a rejection, it was a condition. "You cannot walk both paths," she said, meeting his gaze fully now, and there was no doubt in her voice, no hesitation. "If you stay with them, you will lead them here, whether you mean to or not." And Ethan felt the truth of that settle in his chest, heavy and unavoidable, because she was not accusing him. She was naming something he had not yet faced. He looked down at the map in his hands, at the lines that once felt clear and solid, and now seemed fragile, incomplete, and when he looked back up, there was no longer a question in his eyes, only the quiet recognition that the choice had already been made somewhere between the first step he took toward her and this moment. "Then I do not go back," he said, the words simple, almost quiet, but carrying a finality that did not need to be raised to be understood, and for the first time, something in her expression shifted in a way that could not be mistaken. Not softened, not lowered, but steadied, as if a piece of uncertainty had fallen away. She nodded once, small, deliberate, and turned, not away from him, but forward, toward a path that did not exist on his map, only in the land itself, and for a brief moment, Ethan hesitated, not because he doubted, but because he understood the weight of following her meant leaving something behind that could never be reclaimed. Then the sound of approaching riders broke through the stillness, closer now, undeniable, and without another word, he moved, stepping beside her instead of away, matching her pace as she led them into the narrowing canyon where the shadows grew deeper and the world he knew began to fade behind him. Not all at once, but with each step that carried him further from the man he had been and closer to something he did not yet have a name for, only the quiet certainty that he would not be able to turn back even if he tried. The canyon closed around them slowly, not like a trap, but like a place that decided who belonged and who did not, and Ethan could feel it in the way the air cooled as the walls rose higher on either side, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow path like silent witnesses, while Nayeli moved ahead without hesitation, her steps sure, her pace steady, as if every inch of this land had already been mapped somewhere deep within her memory, not in lines or ink, but in something older, something that did not need to be written to be known. He followed close behind, not crowding her, not falling back, matching her rhythm the way a man learns to do when he understands that leading is no longer his place, and for a while neither of them spoke, because there was no need. The sound of their footsteps against stone, the faint rustle of wind slipping through the narrow pass, all of it filled the space where words might have gone. Somewhere behind them, the distant echoes of riders began to fade, not because the pursuit had ended, but because the path they now walked was not meant to be followed by those who did not understand it. And Ethan realized then that this canyon was more than geography, it was a boundary, one that could not be crossed by force, only by trust. "You walk differently now," Nayeli said. Without turning, her voice carrying easily through the quiet, and Ethan glanced down at his own steps for a brief second before answering. "I am trying not to leave a trail." And though his tone was calm, there was something else beneath it, something that acknowledged how much had already changed in such a short time. She slowed slightly then, just enough that he came alongside her, and for a moment they walked side by side, the distance between them no longer defined by caution, but by something more balanced, something unspoken. "It is not the ground you need to worry about," she said, her eyes lifting toward the narrow strip of sky above them, where light filtered through in thin, shifting lines. "It is what you carry that leaves a mark." And Ethan felt that settle in a place deeper than any instruction he had ever followed, because she was not talking about footprints, she was talking about choices. He looked ahead, then back, the instinct to measure distance still present, still part of him, but softer now, less urgent. And as they moved deeper into the canyon, the path began to shift, narrowing, turning in ways that made direction feel less certain, and more than once he found himself relying not on what he could see, but on where she stepped, trusting that her path would lead somewhere he could not yet imagine. After a while, the canyon opened just enough to reveal a small clearing tucked between the rock walls, a place where the ground flattened and the air felt still as if it had been waiting, and Nayeli stopped there, not abruptly, but with intention, turning to face him fully for the first time since they had entered the pass. For a second, neither of them spoke, and Ethan became aware of the quiet in a new way, not empty, but full of everything they had not yet said. And then she reached up, her fingers brushing the pendant at her throat again, that small piece of turquoise catching the light in a way that seemed almost deliberate. And when she spoke, her voice was softer now, not guarded, but careful. "Do you know what this means?" she asked, lifting the pendant slightly between them. And Ethan shook his head once, slow, because whatever it meant, he knew it was not something he could guess. She studied him for a moment longer, as if deciding how much to reveal, how much he was ready to hear, and then she lowered it again, letting it rest against her chest. "It was given to someone who chose not to take what was easy," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made it feel less like explanation and more like a measure, as if she were placing him against that same standard without saying so directly. Ethan nodded, slightly, not because he fully understood, but because he recognized the weight behind it, and for a moment, something almost like a question formed in his mind, not about the pendant, not about her, but about himself, about whether the path he had stepped onto was one he could walk all the way through, or if it would eventually ask more of him than he could give. Before he could speak, before he could ask anything at all, Nayeli turned again, her gaze shifting toward the far end of the clearing where the canyon narrowed once more into shadow, and though she said nothing, the movement was enough, an unspoken signal that whatever came next would not be explained in words, only understood in action, and Ethan followed, not because he had to, but because somewhere between the first step and now, following her had become the only direction that made sense. The path beyond the clearing narrowed again, but this time it felt different, not like a passage meant to hide, but one meant to test, the ground uneven beneath their boots, scattered with loose stones that shifted if stepped on without care. And Ethan noticed the way Nayeli moved more deliberately now, not slower, but more aware, as if every step carried meaning beyond simply moving forward, and he adjusted without being told, placing his feet where hers had been, matching her pace in silence. The light above thinned into a pale ribbon, barely reaching the canyon floor, and the air grew still in a way that made even small sounds feel louder than they should. The scrape of leather, the quiet exhale of breath, and somewhere in that stillness, Ethan became aware of something else, Not a sound, not movement, but a presence, the kind that did not announce itself but made itself known all the same. Naeli stopped without warning, her hand lifting slightly, not to command, but to signal, and Ethan halted beside her, his eyes scanning the shadows ahead, though he knew better than to expect to see anything immediately, because this was not a place where things revealed themselves easily. For a long moment, nothing happened, the kind of nothing that stretches long enough to make a man question what he thought he felt. And then, slowly, shapes began to form along the edges of the canyon walls, subtle at first, then clearer, figures standing still, watching, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply present in a way that carried quiet authority. Ethan did not reach for anything, did not shift his stance in defense, because something in the way Naeli stood told him this was not a threat, not yet, and more importantly, not his to answer. She stepped forward alone, closing the distance by a few feet, her posture straight, her gaze steady, and though she spoke, her voice did not rise, it did not need to. "He walks with me," she said, and the words carried across the narrow space without force, without urgency. Yet they held something stronger than either, a certainty that did not ask for agreement. The figures did not respond immediately, and in that pause, Ethan felt the weight of their attention settle on him, not hostile, not welcoming, simply measuring, the way one might study a stranger who has stepped into a place they were not expected to be. One of them shifted slightly, stepping just enough into the thin light that his presence became clearer, an older man by the look of him, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp in a way that suggested he saw more than what stood before him, and when he spoke, it was not to Ethan, but to Naeli, in a tone that carried both question and history. "And does he know where he walks?" The words hung there, simple, direct, and Ethan understood then that this was not about permission, it was about truth. Naeli did not look back at him, did not ask for his answer, she gave her own. "He is learning," she said, and though it sounded like a statement, there was something beneath it, something that acknowledged both what he had done and what he had yet to understand. The man's gaze shifted then, settling fully on Ethan, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow again, not to a confrontation, but to a recognition, the kind that asks a question without speaking it, and Ethan met that gaze without turning away, not in defiance, not in pride, but in acceptance of being seen for what he was in that moment, no longer just a soldier, but not yet. Something else. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of decision, quiet and deliberate, and then, just as slowly as they had appeared, the figures stepped back, not vanishing, but receding into the canyon walls, their presence still there, but no longer blocking the path. Naeli did not linger, did not look back, she simply moved forward again, and this time, Ethan understood something he had not before, that walking beside her was no longer just a choice he had made. It was one he would have to keep making, step by step, without certainty, without guarantee, and as he followed, the canyon seemed to open just a little more, not in space, but in meaning, as if the land itself had acknowledged his presence, not as an intruder, but as something yet to be decided. They did not stop again until the canyon finally released them, not suddenly, but in a slow widening that let the sky return inch by inch, the pale blue stretching above like something almost forgotten, and beyond the last curve of stone, the land opened into a quiet valley where the wind moved softer and the earth seemed undisturbed by the weight of passing men. Naeli stepped into that space without hesitation, but her pace changed, not slower, not faster, simply more aware, as if this place required a different kind of presence, and Ethan followed, though something in him recognized that this was no longer a path he could simply walk through. This was a place that would notice him, measure him, remember him. A few scattered structures stood in the distance, not arranged in lines or patterns, but placed with an understanding of the land itself, each one low, built from what the earth offered, blending, rather than claiming, and figures moved between them, not rushing, not stopping, simply continuing their lives in a rhythm that did not change at the sight of a stranger. And that, more than anything, unsettled Ethan, because he was used to being seen, defined, reacted to, and here, he was something else entirely, something unspoken. Naeli slowed as they approached, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but there was something beneath it now, something quieter, something that carried both belonging and responsibility, and when they reached the edge of the settlement, she stopped and turned to him, not blocking his path, but acknowledging it, and for a moment, neither spoke, because words would have felt too small for what this step meant. "From here," she said, her voice calm, "you are no longer passing through." And Ethan understood the weight of that, not as a warning, but as a truth, because stepping into this place meant being seen in a way he had not been before, not as a uniform, not as a role, but as a man defined by his choices. He nodded once, slow, not because he fully understood everything that waited ahead, but because he accepted that he would not turn back now, and that was enough. They moved forward together then, crossing that invisible line between outside and within, and as they did, the subtle shift in the air was almost immediate, not in sound, not in movement, but in awareness, the quiet sense that eyes followed them. Not with suspicion, not with fear, but with a kind of attention that felt deeper than either. A young boy paused near one of the structures, watching them with wide, curious eyes, and an older woman standing nearby rested her hand lightly on his shoulder, not pulling him away, not pushing him forward, simply grounding him in place, her gaze moving from Naeli to Ethan and back again. And in that single look, Ethan felt something he could not quite name, not judgment, not acceptance, something in between, something that waited. Naeli did not stop to explain, did not introduce him. She simply continued, guiding him through the center of the settlement toward a space where the ground was worn smooth from years of quiet. Gathering, and there, near a low fire that had burned down to embers, a man sat, older than the others, his posture relaxed but unmistakably present, as if the space itself arranged around him without effort. He did not look up immediately, did not react to their approach, and for a brief moment, Ethan wondered if he had even noticed them. But then the man spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying without force. "You bring him here," he said, not as a question, but as a statement already. "Understood," and Naeli stopped a few feet away, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. "He walked," she replied, and there was something in the simplicity of that answer that held more meaning than explanation ever could. The man lifted his eyes then, meeting Ethan's gaze directly, and in that moment, the world seemed to quiet once more, not with tension, but with clarity, as if this was the point where everything that had led here would finally be seen for what it was. Not in words, not in judgment, but in something far more final, and Ethan stood there, not as a soldier awaiting orders, not as a man defending his choices, but as someone who understood that whatever came next would not be decided for him. It would be revealed by what he had already done, and for the first time since he stepped into the canyon, he did not feel the need to explain himself, because something told him that here, explanations were not what mattered, only truth. The old man did not speak again right away, and that silence carried a kind of gravity Ethan had never felt before, not the silence of hesitation or uncertainty, but the kind that waits because it already knows what it will hear, and Ethan stood within it, aware of the quiet weight of every gaze that had settled around him. Though none of the others had moved closer, none had spoken, as if this moment belonged only to him, to Naeli, and to the man who now held his attention without effort. The faint crackle of the dying embers between them seemed louder than it should have been, each small sound marking the passing of seconds that felt longer than they were, and Ethan realized that no one here was going to ask him who he was, not in the way he was used to, no rank, no name, no explanation demanded, because those things did not matter in this place, not the way he thought they did. The old man's eyes did not leave his, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, carrying a depth that did not need volume. "You were sent to find us," he said, and it was not a question, not even an accusation, just a simple truth placed between them, and Ethan felt the instinct to answer rise and fall within him, because the words yes or no would not change anything here. "I was," he said at last, his voice even, not defensive, not proud, just honest in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet right, and something in the air shifted, subtle but real, as if that single truth had opened a door that could not be closed again. The old man nodded once, not in approval, not in judgment, simply acknowledging that what had been said was enough, and then his gaze moved briefly to Naeli, not questioning her, not seeking confirmation, but recognizing her presence in the moment, her role in what stood before him, before returning to Ethan again. "And yet you are here," he continued, and this time there was the faintest trace of something beneath the words, not curiosity, not doubt, something closer to understanding, as if he had seen this kind of crossing before, though rarely. Ethan drew a slow breath, the air in this place feeling different somehow, clearer, heavier with meaning, and he answered not with explanation, but with, "The only thing that felt true, I chose to walk." And the words settled into the space between them without resistance, because they did not try to justify, they did not try to persuade, they simply existed. The old man studied him for a long moment, and in that gaze Ethan felt something deeper than judgment, something that looked past the surface of what he had done and into why he had done it, not to excuse, not to condemn, but to see, and for the first time Ethan did not look away, did not brace himself. He simply stood and let himself be seen. Around them, the settlement remained quiet, not frozen, not waiting, just present. The subtle movements of people continuing at the edges of awareness. Reminder that life here did not stop for one man's choice, no matter how heavy it felt to him. Nayeli remained beside him, not speaking, not stepping forward, her presence steady, neither shielding him nor abandoning him, and Ethan understood that this was not her moment to decide, it was his to stand in. The old man shifted slightly then, leaning forward just enough that the movement drew the eye without breaking the calm, and he reached down to the ground beside him, picking up a small object, something simple, worn smooth by time, and he held it for a second before placing it on the ground between them, not offering it, not pushing it forward, just setting it there as if it had always belonged in that space. Ethan glanced at it, then back at the man, understanding without words that this was not a gift, not yet. It was something else, something that asked a question without speaking it, something that required an answer not in words, but in action. And the old man spoke again, his voice quieter now, but no less clear. "Out there," he said, his gaze briefly shifting toward the distant horizon beyond the canyon walls. "Men choose sides because they are told to," and then he looked back at Ethan. "In here, a man chooses because he knows the cost." And the words settled into Ethan with a weight that felt both grounding and heavy, because he did know the cost, at least enough to understand that whatever came next would not give him back what he had left behind. The fire gave a small, final crack as one of the embers shifted, and in that quiet, the moment reached its edge, not with tension, but with clarity, and Ethan looked down once more at the object resting between them. Then back up, meeting the old man's gaze with a steadiness that came not from certainty, but from acceptance, because he understood now that this was not about proving who he was, it was about deciding who he would be when no one else could decide for him. The object between them did not look like much at first glance, just a small piece of carved wood, worn smooth at the edges, its surface marked by lines that did not follow any pattern Ethan recognized. Yet there was something about the way it rested there, still and deliberate, that made it feel heavier than its size, as if it carried something unseen, something that could not be explained by shape or material alone. Ethan lowered his gaze to it again, not rushing, not reaching, because he understood now that in this place, nothing was taken quickly, and everything meant something beyond itself, and when he finally knelt, the movement felt less like submission and more like acknowledgement, not to the man before him, but to the moment itself. His fingers hovered just above the carved surface for a second, feeling the quiet weight of decision settle into that small space between touch and hesitation, and then he picked it up, slow and steady, the wood warm from the ground, as if it had been waiting there longer than it should have. The carvings caught the light in subtle ways, shallow lines intersecting and curving, not forming images, but something closer to memory, and though he did not understand them, he felt the intention behind them, the way they had been made by hands that knew exactly what they were leaving behind. The old man watched without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his eyes attentive in a way that missed nothing, and Nayeli remained where she stood, silent, her gaze resting not on the object, but on Ethan himself, as if this was the moment she had been waiting to see. "What is it?" Ethan asked quietly, not out of doubt, but because he understood that naming something did not reduce its meaning, it revealed it. The old man did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice carried the same calm weight as before. "It is a path," he said, and though the word was simple, it settled into Ethan with a depth that made it clear it was not meant in the way he was used to. Ethan glanced down at it again, turning it slightly in his hand, as if expecting the lines to shift into something clearer, but they did not. They remained exactly as they were, and in that stillness, he began to understand that the path it represented was not something he could follow with his eyes. Every man who stands where you stand is given one. The old man continued, his gaze steady, not to guide his feet, but to remind him of what he carries when he walks. And the words sank deeper than any order Ethan had ever been given, because they did not tell him what to do, they told him what he already was. The wind moved softly through the settlement then, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth, and Ethan felt something shift inside him again. Not sudden, not sharp, but steady, like a weight settling into place where it belonged. "And if I do not know how to read it?" he asked, his voice low, not uncertain, but honest in a way he had come to accept. The old man's expression did not change, but there was something in his eyes now, something that might have been understanding. "Then you will learn," he said simply, and there was no pressure in it, no expectation, only the quiet certainty that learning was not optional, it was inevitable. Ethan nodded once, not because the answer satisfied him in the way he might have expected before, but because it felt true in a way that did not require explanation, and for a moment, the three of them remained there, the object now resting in his hand. The space between them no longer tense, but not yet easy, something balanced, something still becoming. Then, from beyond the edges of the settlement, faint but unmistakable, a sound carried through the air, distant at first, but growing, the rhythm of hooves against dry ground, steady, purposeful, and though it was far enough away that no one reacted immediately, Ethan felt it the moment it reached him, not just as sound, but as consequence, as the part of his past that had not been left behind, only delayed. Naeli's gaze shifted slightly toward the horizon, not with alarm, but with awareness, and the old man did not turn at all, as if he had expected this from the beginning, as if the path placed in Ethan's hand had always been leading to this moment. Ethan tightened his grip on the carved wood just slightly, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because he understood now that whatever choice he had made in the canyon had not ended anything. It had only begun something that would not wait for him to be ready, and as the distant sound grew clearer, carried by the wind across the open land, he stood, not because he was told to, not because he was ordered, but because something inside him understood that standing was the only way forward now, even if he did not yet know what it would cost. The sound of hooves did not rush the valley, it rolled into it, steady and measured, like something that knew exactly where it was going and did not need to hurry, and as it carried across the open land, it did not bring panic with it, only a quiet shift in the air, the kind that made people aware without forcing them to react, and Ethan stood there with the carved wood still in his hand, feeling the rhythm of that distant approach settle into him in a way that felt familiar and distant at the same time, because he knew that sound, he had lived by it, trusted it, followed it, and now it was coming toward him as something else entirely. Naeli did not move at first, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the settlement, where the light shimmered just enough to blur the shapes forming in the distance, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, not raised, not urgent. "They found the edge," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of everything that had been set in motion long before Ethan stepped into the canyon. The old man remained seated, his posture unchanged, his eyes no longer on Ethan but on the land itself, as if he were listening to something deeper than the sound of horses, something that could not be heard by those who only listened for noise, and when he spoke, it was not to either of them, but into the space they shared. "They will not see what stands before them," he said, and Ethan understood then that this was not about hiding, not about escape, it was about something else entirely, something that did not rely on distance or walls. The figures in the settlement did not scatter, did not prepare in the way Ethan would have expected. There was no rush, no raised voices, only a quiet shifting, people moving with purpose but without urgency, as if each one already knew where they needed to be, and that calm unsettled him more than any sign of fear would have, because it meant they were not reacting, they were continuing. Ethan glanced down at the carved piece in his hand, turning it slightly, the lines catching the light again, and for a moment, he saw it differently, not as something given, but as something placed, something that now belonged to him whether he understood it or not. And he realized that whatever happened next would not be separate from that choice, it would be part of it. "They will come through the canyon," he said, his voice low, not as a warning, but as a statement of what he knew, and Naeli nodded once, her gaze still steady on the horizon. "They will try," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that made it clear that trying did not mean succeeding. Ethan took a slow breath, the air filling his lungs with the scent of dust and smoke and something older, something that did not belong to him but now surrounded him, and for the first time, he did not think about where he would stand in formation, did not measure distance or advantage. He thought about direction, about what it meant to stand here instead of there, and the weight of that choice settled deeper than any order ever had. The sound of hooves grew clearer now, distinct, individual, no longer a distant echo but a presence that would soon cross into sight, and Ethan felt the pull of memory with it, the faces, the voices, the men who would be riding at the front, men who once stood beside him, trusted him, expected him to be where they were, and he knew that when they saw him here, standing where he stood now, they would not understand, not because they could not, but because they would not know how. Nayeli turned to him then, her expression steady, not questioning, not uncertain, simply present, and for a brief moment, the world narrowed again to just the two of them, not separated by distance, but connected by something neither of them had named, and she said only one thing, quiet and clear. "You do not have to stand here," and the words carried no pressure, no expectation, only the truth that the choice remained his, even now. Ethan looked at her, then past her, toward the edge of the valley where the first shapes of riders were beginning to take form against the light, and then back at the carved piece in his hand, and in that moment, he understood something that had been building since the first step he took toward her in the canyon, that choosing once was not enough, that every step after required the same decision again, and he closed his hand around the wood, not tightly, not as a shield, but as something held with intention, and when he looked up again, his gaze did not waver, not toward the horizon, not toward her, because he had already chosen where he would stand, even if no one else yet understood why. The riders did not rush into the valley, they slowed as they reached its edge, their horses stepping carefully onto ground that did not belong to them, and the line they formed was not tight or aggressive, it was measured, cautious, as if even they felt the difference in the air, the way sound carried differently here, the way the land did not echo their presence the way it did elsewhere. Ethan recognized them before he could make out their faces clearly, the shapes, the posture, the way they sat in the saddle with the quiet confidence of men who believed they were where they were supposed to be, and at the front, one figure rode slightly ahead of the others, not by much, just enough to show authority without needing to declare it. And as the distance closed, Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not fear, not regret, something closer to memory pressing against the present. The riders came to a stop a few dozen yards from the settlement, not crossing fully into it, not yet, and, for a moment, no one spoke, the space between them filled with dust settling slowly back to the ground, with the faint sound of leather creaking and horses breathing, and Ethan stood where he had chosen to stand, not stepping forward, not stepping back, his hands still resting around the carved wood, feeling its edges press lightly into his palm. The man at the front lifted his chin slightly, his gaze scanning the settlement before settling on Ethan, and when recognition hit, it did not come with surprise, it came with a tightening of the jaw, a stillness that spoke louder than any words, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried across the space between them, controlled, steady. "Cole," he said, not as a greeting, not as a question, but as a statement that held everything they had been and everything they were no longer. Ethan met his gaze without flinching, without lowering his eyes, because there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to explain in a way that would change what stood before them, and he answered simply, "Captain," and the word settled into the air like something from another life. A murmur moved faintly through the line of riders, subtle, restrained, but present, because seeing him there, standing where he stood, did not fit the story they had carried with them, and the captain's eyes did not leave Ethan's. "You were ordered to report," he said, his tone unchanged, not accusing, not forgiving, just stating what should have been, and Ethan felt the weight of that expectation, the familiar pull of it, the part of him that had always answered without question, and yet it no longer held him the same way. "I did not," Ethan replied, and there was no defiance in his voice, no attempt to justify, only the truth laid out as plainly as it could be, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that could have been said but was not. The captain's gaze flickered briefly past Ethan, taking in the figures of the settlement, the stillness of the people, the way no one moved to challenge them, and something unreadable passed through his expression before his eyes returned to Ethan again. "You crossed a line?" he said, quieter now, not for the others, but for the man he had once known, and Ethan understood that he was not talking about distance, not about territory, but something deeper, something that could not be mapped or measured. Ethan took a slow breath, the carved wood shifting slightly in his hand as his grip adjusted, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single exchange, not between two sides, but between two men standing on opposite ends of a choice, and he answered, not quickly, not loudly, but with a steadiness that came from knowing there was no other answer left. "I chose where to stand," he said, and the words carried across the space without force, without anger, but with a finality that did not ask to be understood. The captain held his gaze for a long moment, and in that silence, something passed between them that the others could not see, not agreement, not acceptance, something closer to recognition, the understanding that the man before him was no longer the one who had ridden out under his command, and that whatever came next would not change that. The wind moved lightly through the valley, stirring dust at the edges, and behind Ethan, the settlement remained still, not retreating, not advancing, simply present, and for the first time since the riders had arrived, the line between them felt less like a boundary and more like a question, one that neither side had yet answered, and Ethan stood within it, not waiting for permission, not waiting for orders, but holding his place with the quiet certainty that whatever happened next would not come from force. It would come from the choices already made, and the ones still waiting to be seen. The silence that followed Ethan's words did not break the way silence usually does. It did not collapse under pressure or scatter into noise. It held, steady and deliberate, stretching between the riders and the settlement like something alive, something waiting to see which way it would turn. And in that stillness, even the horses seemed to settle, their restless shifting easing into quiet patience, as if they too understood that this moment was not meant for movement but for decision. The captain remained where he was, his posture unchanged, but his eyes no longer carried the same certainty they had when he first spoke. Something there had shifted, subtle but undeniable, not doubt, not hesitation, something closer to wait, as if Ethan's presence in that place had forced him to see a version of the world that did not fit neatly into the lines he had always followed. Behind Ethan, the old man rose slowly to his feet, not in challenge, not in defense, simply standing, and that single motion drew attention without effort, the kind of attention that did not demand to be given but could not be ignored once it was, and when he stepped forward, it was not toward the riders, but to stand just within the edge of the space Ethan held, not replacing him, not shielding him, but standing alongside the choice that had been made. Nayeli remained where she was, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, and yet there was something in the way she watched the captain now, something that carried both understanding and distance, as if she had seen this moment before in other forms, with other men, and knew how easily it could turn, how quickly it could be lost if someone chose the wrong kind of strength. The captain exhaled slowly, the sound almost lost in the open air, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not for lack of authority, but because something in the moment no longer required it. "You think standing there changes anything?" he said, not harshly, not dismissively, but as a man trying to hold onto something he was not sure he could still define, and Ethan felt that question settle into him, not as a challenge but as something worth answering. He looked past the captain then, at the line of riders behind him, men who had followed the same orders he once had, who believed in the same lines drawn on maps, who trusted that those lines meant something real, and for a moment, he saw himself among them, not as he was now, but as he had been, certain, unquestioning, and he understood then that nothing he said would change that in them, not in this moment. "No," Ethan said, his voice steady, calm. "It does not change anything out there," and he gestured slightly toward the open land beyond the valley, not accusing, not dismissing, just acknowledging. "But it changes what stands here." And as the words left him, the weight of them settled into the space between them, not loud, not forceful, but clear in a way that did not need to be repeated. The captain held his gaze, and for a long second, the two men stood there, not as enemies, not as allies, but as something far more complicated, two men who had reached the same place by different paths and now stood on opposite sides of what that place meant. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of distant land beyond the valley, and the captain's eyes shifted briefly, not away from Ethan, but beyond him, taking in the stillness of the settlement, the lack of fear, the absence of resistance, and something in that absence seemed to speak louder than any display of force could have. He straightened slightly in his saddle, the motion small but deliberate, and the line of riders behind him shifted with him, not advancing, not retreating, simply adjusting to the movement of the man they followed. And for a moment, it seemed as if the entire moment balanced on that single choice, whether to move forward or to remain where they were. Then, without raising his voice, without giving an order in the way Ethan would have expected, the captain spoke. "We ride at first light," he said, not to Ethan, not to the settlement, but to the men behind him, and though the words were simple, they carried something new, something that had not been there before, not defeat, not surrender, but a decision to step back from. Something he did not fully understand. The riders did not question, did not argue, they simply turned, one by one, their horses shifting direction with quiet obedience, and as they began to move away from the valley, the sound of hooves returned, not as an approach this time, but as a departure, steady and fading with distance. Ethan watched them go, not with relief, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding that nothing had been won here, nothing had been lost in the way he once measured things. Something else had happened, something that did not fit into the language of victory or defeat, and as the last of the riders disappeared beyond the rise, the valley settled back into its stillness, unchanged and yet not the same, because the line that had once separated them had not been erased. It had simply been seen for what it was, and for the first time, Ethan understood that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is not to cross that line, but to stand at its edge, and refuse to let it decide who he is. The valley did not celebrate their departure. It did not shift or brighten or carry any sign that something important had just passed through it. It simply remained as it was, quiet, steady, unchanged in a way that made everything that had happened feel both real and strangely distant, as if the land itself refused to measure moments the way men did. Ethan stood where he had been, his eyes following the last traces of movement beyond the ridge until even the sound of hooves faded completely into silence. And when that silence settled fully, it felt different now, not tense, not waiting, but complete, like a breath finally released. He did not move right away, because there was nothing left to react to, nothing left to prepare for, only the weight of what had already been chosen, and in that stillness, he became aware again of the carved wood in his hand, its surface warm now, shaped by his grip as much as by the hands that had made it, and he turned it slightly, not searching for meaning, but acknowledging that whatever meaning it held was no longer separate from him. Behind him, the quiet rhythm of the settlement resumed without announcement. Footsteps, soft voices, the low movement of daily life continuing as it always had, and that continuity felt more powerful than anything else, because it did not depend on what had just happened, it existed beyond it. Nayeli stepped closer then, not hurried, not hesitant, her presence settling beside him in a way that felt natural now, no longer defined by distance or uncertainty, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed to be said to explain what had already been understood. She looked toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared, her expression unreadable, not softened, not hardened, simply steady, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity it always had. "They will return," she said, not as a warning, not as a prediction meant to unsettle, but as a truth that did not need to be feared. Ethan nodded once, because he knew that as well, not as a soldier thinking in terms of strategy, but as a man who understood that some paths did not end, they only paused, and next time, he said quietly, his gaze still on the horizon, they may not turn away. And the words did not carry dread, only recognition, because he no longer measured what would come by whether it could be avoided, but by whether he would still stand the same way when it arrived. Nayeli studied him then, not for long, but long enough to see that the man beside her was no longer divided in the way he had been when they first met, that whatever line had once pulled at him no longer held the same power, and she gave a small nod, not approval, not agreement, simply acknowledgement. The old man's voice came from behind them, low, steady. "The land does not ask a man to be certain," he said, and when Ethan turned, he saw him standing near the dying embers once more, as if he had never moved at all. "It asks him to be true when he is not." And the words settled into the air without force, without expectation, but with a weight that felt final in a way nothing else had. Ethan looked down at the carved piece again, then back at the valley, at the people who moved within it without needing to prove anything, and he understood then that the path he held was not something he would finish, it was something he would carry, something that would ask him the same question again and again in different forms, and that the answer would never come from certainty, only from the choice to stand where it mattered. He slipped the carved wood into his coat, not hiding it, not displaying it, simply keeping it close, and when he looked up again, the horizon no longer felt like a line dividing two worlds, it felt like a place where those worlds met, uncertain, unfinished, but real. The wind moved softly through the valley, carrying the quiet sounds of life, and Ethan stood there a moment longer before turning away from the edge, not because he was leaving it behind, but because he understood now that the line he had once crossed was not out there anymore, it was within him, and it would follow him wherever he chose to walk next, and in that understanding, there was no victory, no defeat, only a quiet kind of peace that did not need to be named, because out here, a man was not defined by the side he stood on, but by the moment he chose to stand still and refuse to become something he no longer believed in.